But thank you very much for inviting me today and your trip here in Copenhagen. I hope you have had some inspiring journey already. And I also hope that this short lecture will provide you with even more knowledge and insights into the question of how school architecture is developing these years. I know you've already seen the different schools here in Copenhagen, which is great. This will be more on some more theoretical aspects of it and not so much in practice. So hopefully it will make up for a good balance. As Nitsan said, my name is Kasper Stolz. I have been working within the field of school architecture and learning space design for 12 years now, both theoretically as an independent researcher and external lecturer at the University of Aarhus, as well as in practice as a designer and a developer of educational building design and learning spaces in formal institutional settings, such as primary schools, high schools, kindergartens, and universities. For the last 3 years, I was a partner at an architectural firm called Nerd Architects, but I ended my work there. I was head of research and development, but in August I decided to step down to write a book I've always wanted to write about the future of educational architecture, and just focus more on being an independent researcher. As you probably guessed already, I don't know if Nitsan said, I'm not a classically trained architect. I have a scientific background with a master's degree in what's called material culture and didactics, which means I have studied the relation between physical surroundings and the human behavior, perceptual psychology, behavioral theory, and of course, learning processes in relation to the material world. This means that my focus is not on architecture and space itself from a pure aesthetical or technical perspective, but more on how we as humans are affected by these spaces that we're in, especially in educational settings among kids and youth in our schools. So this makes me what you could call a didactical designer, meaning I approach design of space and buildings from a didactical perspective, always with the student and always with learning at the core of the decision making. So I don't start in the context of, whoa. Great, that's good. Yeah? Is that okay? Can you still see anything? Yes. Great, I can see something too. Right. I was just guessing. Do you understand my English? Is it okay? Yeah, right. All right, cool. So, basically, this is the field I'm working in, with learning and behavior on one side and architecture and space on the other. I still see a lot of people in the industry and also teachers, people working in schools that tend to focus only on one of them and forget about the other. Only focusing on kids learning and not focusing on the actual place they're learning in, or the other way around, focusing only on the space and then try to put some students in there and trying to let the teaching adapt to the space. That can be out of many reasons. That can be a thing of tradition. School architecture has become a very complex matter within the architectural industry, and you need knowledge beyond what you probably learn in architectural school to also know a lot about learning theory and behavior in kids and young adults. And on the other hand, scientists that know a lot about learning and behavior are not trained architects. So we often see a gap here, and we often see not necessarily a miscommunication, but just speaking two different languages. You put an architect next to a teacher, and they speak two different languages. My work, part of my work has been to create a common language between those two and trying to bridge this, these two different approaches to the actual building. The teacher is also focusing on the building, is also focusing on the physical space, but with another language, with another perspective, with another set of eyes. So when I work as an advisor for municipalities or stakeholders, it's partly to translate between those who are using the buildings and those who are actually building the buildings. See if this one works. Because architecture do affect what's happening. It does change our behavior. We are prone to be nudged by the spaces we're in, and the other way around too. My behavior will somehow affect the space. I change the space, and the space changed me. And it's extremely important that we're constantly aware of this very dynamic intellectual interplay. Just to start out with an example, this was from a brand new school in Norway, very, very expensive. And it's a library. And from a library has, I tend to speak of intentionality. What's the actual intention with the place? And the actual intention with the library and the main focus there on its function will be reading, which means hard focus, deep cognitive processing, and some kind of a safe and warm atmosphere. And when you look at that, it's not really what you see. It's not the sense you get of the place that it's actually designed for deep work or sitting for long hours, reading a book. So this is what happens, or this is one way of understanding it. We have, every time we build a space, we have what I would call the intentionality of a place. What is the main intentions? Here, it was a library. And then we have the actual design of the space. If things work, there is a 1-to-1 ratio here. My intentionality of place mirrors the exact design of the space. But often it's not like that. It more looks like this, and sometimes this arrow doesn't even hit this one. Because here, if we say the intentionality is deep work, it's reading, it's focus, it's concentration, and it's staying for long hours, the design is more intended to the cleaning staff, I would say, and economics, and a lack of decision-making on the room layout. If you just look at the lighting itself, if you want to focus on reading, and if you want to stay focused, you often need concentrated light sources. To do that, you would have to make a decision exactly where you would sit and read when you started mapping or laying out the room. This is the easy version, because here, by putting in these omnipresent lights, the architect or the designer doesn't really have to have any reflections of what's happening where. everything can happen everywhere. So putting in lights like this is also a way of saying, I don't know anything about what's actually going to happen in this room, and I don't know where it's going to take place either. So here there is quite a distance between the intentionality and the actual design, and the result here is nobody uses this room. The students don't want to be there, the kids don't like it, and when you walk in there, just your own sense of feeling is kind of, I would call it a human hostile environment. All the surfaces are extremely hard, there's no softness in here, and there is nothing really there are no physical aspects in here except for the books that reminds us of the actual culture that are related to libraries. So from my point of view and my perspective, this is definitely not a well-designed library. Mainly because those who designed it didn't really dig deep into what is actually going to happen in here. Who is going to use it? Why are they going to use it? What type of hours are they going to use it? There were a lot of questions here that were not answered. So that's part of my job, to see that these two actually correlate in real life. That was just a short example on how to understand spaces. Of course, I come from a scientific background, and over the course of the last 10 years, there has been a tremendous amount of research on school architecture and learning space design. Like 30 years ago, there was hardly anything. And if you start digging into it, you will see that there are evidence that shows a tremendous amount of impacts on a lot of different aspects that relates to students' learning processes. We have clear evidence that we can strengthen the attention span in students depending on how we use lighting, colors, the layout of the room. We can also strengthen we affect the level of concentration with the physical space, depending on, and we'll come back to that in more detail, depending on how much visual noise we're exposed to. It can also affect how we socially interact with each other or feel safe. It can motivate students for learning or the other way around. It affects our personal well-being, and it even can affect the academic performance and the level of grades. I'll show you one study there. So just to map out that, it has become very clear that making school architecture or doing school architecture has exceeded the role of traditional architectural work. So many different aspects has come into play: social semiotics, neuroscience, perceptual psychology, and so that calls for that when we build schools now or develop them, that we work as interdisciplinary teams, that we sit together, teachers with architects, with researchers, with stakeholders, with students even, so we get a more holistic understanding and approach when we design these places. And it depends. We try that in Denmark a lot, but we don't always succeed. But there is starting to come a shift of mindset that we have to work more interdisciplinary. And the teams that we are on when we build schools are growing in numbers. There are experts on sustainability, experts on learning like me, experts on materials, experts on psychology, and so on. And of course, architects and engineers. So, what I also was asked to talk a little bit about today is where is education right now? Where is schooling? Where is it going? some things and I can mostly speak out of the Nordic educational system, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, which has a lot of similarities. I know very little about the Israeli educational system, a little bit more about the European in general. But some parts of the educational system is almost the same everywhere, in every country, even no matter where it is. And one thing that is almost always the same is that a lot of the classrooms looks like this. No matter where you go in the world, even in Denmark. I see hundreds and hundreds of schools in Denmark, and we should be the front runners in school architecture. But I still see that the majority of the classrooms looks exactly like this. So not everything has changed. But if we want to understand and see where school architecture is going, we have to look somewhere else than in architecture itself. We have to look at the society and where society is going. Because the primary role of education is to educate the new generations to be able to live in this new society. So if we just change the focus a little bit and look at what is the context right now that these young people and ourselves that we're in, because that should inform us of how school architecture which direction it should develop over time. We could call it current problems in society and in the educational system. A lot of the data I have here is Danish, but I know that it's more or less similar to a lot of other European countries. We have one big problem that's around mental health. We have kids with anxiety and depression, ADHD, and eating disorder that has tripled in the period of 2006 to 2016. We also have kids diagnosed with within the autism spectrum has gone up 40% in the period of 2013 to 2017. So something tells us that these new generations are suffering in another way than we were, maybe. Or we've been better at diagnosing, or we have been more focused on kids' well-being more than we were before. But it still asks the question, these numbers are increasing, which means the way we do education has not helped solving this problem. So school hasn't been part of the solution, apparently. If it was, these numbers would go down. So school might more actually be part of the problem, with which more and more scientists within the field of pedagogics and learning are saying. Another problem generally is motivation, at least in Denmark. The older the kids get, the less they actually want to learn. It's not that they don't want to learn, because in their spare time, they do a lot of learning, all the time. It's not that they just sit at home doing nothing. But their motivation for traditional school learning is just dropping the older they get. This is 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade. The red one is girls, the blue one is boys. And it's just, so the older the student gets, the more bored they find school. And then some would say, well, does it have to be fun to go to school? And the question is actually, yes. Because if we are bored, we don't learn. If you are bored now, if you think this is boring, you stop listening. If you stop listening, you don't get it, and you don't remember it, and you learn nothing. It has to be fun in some sort of way. And fun doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be serious, but just fun in the sense of that you can see the purpose of you doing it, and that you actually get some kind of arousal out of it. So this is a pretty big problem too. We do these national surveys every year, something called Danish Center of Educational Environment, and these numbers hasn't changed yet. That was like local problems. Then we have a really big global problem that these new generations, much more than our generations, are focusing on. They're talking about climate anxiety. My own kids are afraid in a whole other level than I am. It's really what they talk about. And they have so many questions around it. And what I see and what others see is that this thing about handling being in a climate crisis is not something that's really part of the primary schooling educational system. They might read a little bit about it, but they are not building the competences to actually handle and being able to process and do something about this. I have a daughter, she's 12 years old, and she's trying every way she can to deal with this issue. She stopped eating meat, she's sorting her garbage, she's only wearing reused clothes. And one day she said it to her teacher, and he said, you know what, it's not really important, right? You have to focus on doing your math. And that's a very expensive Danish primary school. You should, for some reason, I don't know, expect that you would have teachers there, I don't know, it's a prejudice, but that were more focused on what is the world that these kids are experiencing. If school doesn't reflect the world of the kids, kids don't see the meaning of why they should be there. And then we get a lot of these guys or girls. Greta Thunberg stopped going to school because she couldn't see the point of it. So she just stopped. And now she has become like a movement with more than 10, 20 million followers. And she is like a symbol of a whole new generation. And what she basically says is, if you adults, us, if we don't do something with this problem, and if my schooling and if my education is not addressing this issue and helping me handle this, I don't see why I should go to school at all. I much rather do something about the environment instead. So this is a global issue that has a very strong impact on every single kid or young that either read newspapers or are on social media. So that's another question, and something that relates, everything we talk about here always relates back to school architecture in one way. So the question here is, how can school architecture or learning space design be part of the solution of addressing the climate crisis towards students and young adults, helping them or giving them the skill set to actually cope with these fears? Because we are in a difficult place right now. As Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum said, we are right now at a cornerstone in human history, where the decisions and choices we make today will determine how everyday life will look like for the new generations. And this goes for education and schooling too, right? If society changes, we need to change. We need to change the way we build schools because we need to change the way we teach kids. Going back to the first slide I showed you, that you can't really separate learning from learning space. And what is changing rapidly is how society also affects the way we live our lives. Asking for new types of skills. This is more or less a life path in the industrial paradigm. This is my father. He went to schooling. He went to school for a very short time. He got a job. He stayed in that job, and now he's retired. And in a minute, he's going to die. That was more or less his life path. He didn't change it at all. This is the life path of my kids. In the post-industrial paradigm, they start schooling, but they go to school way longer. My dad stopped going to school when he was 15. I stopped going to school when I was 32. That's the double. Then I got into a job. Then I found out that I needed a career change. That meant I had to learn new skills, so I went back to school. Now I met a girl, so I had to move to another culture, which means I had to learn another language, and so on and so forth. These are two extremely different ways of living. And it calls for two extremely different ways of skills and knowledge in a person. So we're looking into a learning landscape that has to address this way of living, because this is how the life of the new generations look like. They're going to change extremely, and they're going to change very fast, because society changes very, very fast. The problem is, a lot of scientists conclude, and also already back in 2016, well, they write the same almost every year because it doesn't change. While today's schools focus almost only on academic achievements, skills related to the individual's capacity for innovation, problem solving, cooperation, and self-observation has become even more important. That's what we used to call soft skills, where hard skills was like reading and writing and knowing about physics. But these soft skills has become increasingly important, and we still, even in the Danish educational system, are not very good at actually doing it. I have one case school with me today, and that school is based more or less on soft skills, but within a Danish educational system with all the hard skills as well and all the subjects. But it's really not where we are at all. But this calls for another type of learning, calls for another type of teaching, and which calls for another type of setting. Because this is what school architecture should be able to support. It should be able to support an environment, a learning environment, where kids are taught how to be adaptable to change, where they get really good at cooperating, where they strengthen their curiosity, their creativity, their problem-solving skills, their ability to imagine things that are not there, their entrepreneurship, and their critical thinking. This is also what's called 21st century learning skills. It comes in different, you've probably met them before, and they're not going away. Even the biggest businesses, biggest scientists, biggest educational thinkers are more or less all agreeing on that if the next generations are to solve the problems that we gave them, like climate, war, inequality, these are actually the skills that they have to adapt to. So, now we move closer to the actual physical place. This is more or less what it has been looking like for the last 50, 60 years. Still what it looks like in a lot of schools in Denmark too, my kids' schools included. One class, 28 kids, with one teacher and one subject. 45 minutes, and then they change into another subject, and then they change into another subject, so they have language, math, physics, geography, religion, and they don't change space, and sometimes they don't even change teachers. That type of learning environment is not the most optimal for developing the skills we talked about before. And so we see a shift now. There is a new learning paradigm on the way, and it's shifting towards that students work in teams. That kind of changes depending on the assignment, where teachers are not alone, but usually co-teach, where two or even more teachers design the learning course together. and where you combine all the subjects. One of the most famous schools for doing this are high-tech high schools in California, in San Diego. I was there 6 years ago. It's very interesting to look into. Their architecture is completely different from anything else I've seen. There's learning spaces looks completely different. I couldn't even hardly see it was a school when I went in there. I haven't brought it with me today. I've only brought a Danish school. But if you get the opportunity, try to look up high-tech high. And the name is kind of not really fitting. It's more than just high-tech. It's a normal primary school that has all the regular subjects. They also just have a very strong focus on digital technology.
The movement of high-tech is very big in Israel.
What?
The movement of high-tech is very big in Israel.
Is it?
Yeah.
Huh, cool. Well, it's bigger than here then. There's only 7 schools in Denmark that are actually inspired by high-tech high. But that's cool. Great. I don't know. Is there any water anywhere?
Yeah, I'll bring you one.
Will you? Okay, we change the focus a little bit to what we actually know from a scientific perspective of what has an impact. We don't have time, I don't have time to go over all of them, so I just picked some of them out that I find very interesting. And interesting because it doesn't necessarily need to, we don't necessarily need to tear down all school buildings and build them up from the bottom. A lot of changes can be made within the existing buildings and actually have quite a huge impact. It's not about beautiful facades. It's much more in the details. It's there that we are affected in our behaviors. Generally, when we look over these more or less traditional classrooms, we know that a room, whatever room it is, actually affects our behavior in a lot of different ways. And it also shows us, it has a language. I call it the language of space. This room, like any other room, has a language, and I can speak with it. And when I enter a room like this, it says something to me. And if it's a room, a type of room that I've come in a lot of times, I know exactly what the traditions are. If I enter a mosque and has never been to a mosque before, I might not know exactly what to do. I don't know the language of the space. But a space like this, a lot of people know, especially those that have actually gone to a school. This room tells us several things. It tells me that everybody in here are the same, apparently. Because there is only one way of sitting, and there is only one type of chair and one type of desk, and it's all facing one way. So it tells me that everybody in here has the same needs at the same time, and are more or less equally big too. So there is this language of a monotony or a homogeneous look on the human being as one crowd, which are more or less the same. In terms of activities, it also tells me that there is basically only one activity I can do in here. I can sit down and I can listen, or I can work with desk work, either a pen or a book or a computer. And why I took this picture is because we're going to talk a little bit about sitting. We're sitting right now. And human beings sit like crazy. And our generations sit down even more than prior generations did, because our type of work are changing. So we sit and we sit and we sit. The kids sit at school for 8 hours.
And when they come home, they sit again in front of their screens. And we do the same. We sit at our offices. So this whole thing about sitting is also called sedentarism and is a field of study in itself, which is very, very interesting. Because we might find some of the solution to some of our problems addressing learning around this culture of sitting. First of all, one scientist notes that if you sit for long hours, you experience no isometric contraction of the anti-gravity postural muscles. That's the muscles you use when you balance. It's the muscles that I use right now. You hardly use any muscles at all when you're sitting right now. But if you tip the chair, you activate these types of muscles. And when you activate them, your blood flow starts circulating faster. So that's why kids, when they're bored and tired, they start tipping their chairs. And is that allowed? No. If they do that, they are breaking a rule. What they're actually doing is trying to make it easier to stay focused. But here comes an old pedagogical culture that are in contrast to the actual need. We could also, so there are several ways of solving it. We could say, okay, tip your chairs, because it means that you won't make so much noise and you will stay more focused. And me as a teacher would like that. So please tip your chairs. Or another solution would be changing chairs so it was actually made for tipping, or removing chairs so you couldn't sit this way. So that's just one example of how a physical object and a design of something affects our behavior and the way that kids especially interact with this physical object. And the goal is always to be as comfortable as possible. So that's why they tip their chairs. I was a teacher too for 6 years, and in my classes, I always started saying, you can tip your chairs as much as you like. And the kids was like, what? Can we tip our chairs? Sure, I said, if you really need to. And the first 2 weeks, everybody would be falling because no kids have trained their balance anymore. They don't have any balance. So I would constantly have this, somebody would fall in the back. But after a few weeks, they were really good at it. And I got a lot of problems with the headmaster and with the other teachers. But the kids loved it, and I had full focus. Another thing is, when we sit, that's two German scientists looking into the more neurophysiological aspects of it. To sit on a chair takes effort, reduces breathing, stiffens the muscles, and changes the relation between our senses. To sit reduces the ability to move, damming body heat, and constrains the ability to physical aggression. It limits the impulsive and immediate ability to express emotions and affections. That's pretty crazy. We have a huge problem with kids with ADHD, attention deficit disorder, which relates to that they are not able to actually express their emotions. Could be that some of the solution to that problem was if we stopped having them sitting down all the time in 8 hours every day, and maybe telling their parents that when they come home they should do something else than sit on their room with an iPhone or playing the computer. But what it also does is that it's damming up body heat. Have you tried to be in a small room with a lot of bodies and suddenly it gets very, very warm? It would get cooler if you moved around, but would be the same amount of bodies because you would move air around. So, talking about indoor climate, which we often do as architects, we talk about the technical aspects, but there is a behavioral aspects of indoor climate too. It's not only about changing the ventilation system or having automatic doors, it's also how we behave in this space. The longer time we sit bodies down in the same room without moving, the more difficult it will be to control the temperature in there. So that's just another thing of just focusing on a chair in itself, out of all the other things. This is another thing that's interesting. This is the activity of places in the brain. This is an EEG, a brain scan of a person who's been sitting down for 20 minutes. This is, the blue area suggests a dip in neural resources devoted to focus. This is the brain areas working that are related to focus and attention for a person who's been hoofing around for 20 minutes. And hoofing around, it's what I do right now. So this is your brain. And this is my brain. See the problem? I don't get tired. You do. I could be standing here for 2 hours, 3 hours, and I wouldn't get tired. Why? Because I get to move. You will just drop and drop and drop and drop because your blood circulation goes down, so you don't get oxygen around to your body and especially not to your brain, so you get more and more tired, and the more tired you get, the more you have difficulties concentrating, focusing, trying to do other things to try to activate yourself. So this is just out of 20 minutes of sitting. That suggests that if we want to have kids learning, or adults, we should do something else than just sit all the time. It is difficult in lectures like this, I know, but with another room layout, with chairs where you could actually tip, places you could stand during the presentation, would actually make a difference. And here's an interesting thing. It's a small design hack that actually has a huge impact. If the student stands for 3 out of those 8 hours they would have been sitting during the day, it increased their combustion over a year that corresponds to running 7 marathons. There's a tendency in the Danish school system about movement. There was an educational reform saying kids have to move more. Because we have problems with obesity, kids that get, too many kids are getting too fat, too fast. So the educational reform was that every teacher had to make sure that all the kids move their bodies 45 minutes every day. The way that Danish teachers actually coped with that was to there was all these funny ways of doing it. They were trying to incorporate it into the more traditional teaching, trying to jump a letter, and it was so weird, and none of the kids actually liked it in any way. And the other part was more free time where they just had to run around the building. So there are other ways that get the body moving than to ask it to run around a building or dance. It is this hoofing around thing. If we created a learning space environment, if we created school architecture that supported this possible movement, where it was possible for me to actually move whenever I wanted to without it being a problem, we could actually make a change here. And just standing is equaling a combustion of running 0 marathons over a year. So we could actually help with obesity too, if we change this layout. So the conclusion of that, and my point when speaking of learning space design, which relate to how we set the framing of school architecture, is that the best position is always the next position. We can't design one chair that works for 8 hours at a time. It's not possible. We can't solve it with one design. What we have to design is a change of behavior. And the way we change the behavior is by creating a much more diverse layout in terms of interior, just in itself. And I think that would be, speaking of sitting down, I have to walk the talk, and you have to move a little bit. So I think we should take 5 minutes. And I need to also stand up, otherwise the next 30 minutes would be, you would lose them. So get up, get some coffee, get some water, and be sitting there listening while the teachers are talking and talking. That makes classes really long. So this guy or girl or whoever it is addresses a situation where it's the teacher, like me, who has the power and are talking and talking, and you are sitting and sitting. That's one thing that they address, is making it very hard to go to school. Another one says, a good day is when we build something and learn something from it at the same time. So not just building for the sake of building, but actually learning out of it. So he or she points to the aspect of being physically involved in the work. And another one says, it's fun being in school when we do something else than just sit on a chair. Then I can focus a little better. And this one is very funny. I think they train us for being in an office because we always just sit and work at a desk. And maybe we do. Maybe it's just offices we're taught to work in. The conclusion from the scientists were equally interesting. It said they concluded that student children that had shown difficulties in paying attention were able to concentrate and focus when the teaching involved the senses, was tangible and practical. And another conclusion, the many difficulties children express on their everyday school life seems to diminish or disappear when they work with meaningful content in a good atmosphere. There's a lot of architecture in those two quotes, and a lot of learning space design. Because it asks a lot of questions. How can we create a school architecture and a learning space design where it's easy for the teachers to facilitate learning processes where all the senses are included, where students work with tangible material that they understand, and where they do practical work? How can we create an environment where they work with meaningful content, not just a classical theoretical book about climate change, but meaningful content, meaning working with climate change, for instance, or the climate crisis, in a good atmosphere, meaning a safe atmosphere where I like to be, and where the physical spaces are suited for my physical being. Another one that is interesting is light. There were Henning Larsen, a big Danish architectural company, one of their scientists did a huge experiment at a school in another city in Denmark called Aarhus, where they wanted to see if they worked with settings of downlight like this in math classes, if it actually changed anything. So they did a year of surveys on two different, a control group that was in a normal light setting, and then this group that was sitting always working under a downlight like this. And it showed that they gained 12% in math performance over a year from the control group. Just alone was the hypothesis of sitting with a focused, concentrated light. It also created these variation of light zones. Here there is a shift between light and shadow. So there is actually another type of perceptual dynamics from a visual perspective in a room where you have variations in lighting. And it actually increased students' ability to stay focused for longer. And the third thing it did, because that's another problem we have in the teaching situation, it's all the noise. And we usually, when we focus on indoor climate or good learning space environments, a lot of focus is on acoustics, of course. But mostly, we look at acoustics from a technical or physiological perspective, thinking, okay, we have to put on a lot of acoustic ceilings, whatever, and we should, of course. It's not always it's possible, but this is just another thing that shows that if we change the design, we change the behavior. Because working in settings where this lighting was focused like this, they noticed that the noise level decreased. The kids started talking softer to each other, not yelling as much, just by changing the design of the artificial light in the physical space. That's noise reduction that's pretty cheap. And it doesn't look as bad as some acoustic solutions does around the world. This one we have to skip. A third thing that we also know, which I'm very focused on and has been for the last year, is what nature does to the human being and what nature does to kids and nature in general. There are so many concerns around nature. One thing that we're losing it. The other part is how can we benefit from it? How can we reconnect? Because the modern man and woman, modern human being, has kind of lost the connection to nature. We see that also statistically. It's only like 22% of Danish kids has ever tried to sleep outside in a tent, for instance. 10% have ever held a frog in their hand. Like, modern kids has no contact to nature. How are we going to solve the climate crisis and solve the biodiversity crisis if we have no relation to it? And there's been a lot of scientific studies into what nature does to us. And one thing is, I just took one study here that concludes that evidence shows that exposure to natural places can lead to positive mental health outcomes. Analysis reported significant improvements in self-esteem and mood. Okay, so speaking of a good atmosphere, speaking of inclusivity of kids that has low mental health, speaking of the need of being able to focus and relax, this space surpasses even the best architecture in the world for doing that. No construction built by man will ever be as well designed as a forest like this. So, and it's just within the last 3 or 4 years that they've started focusing. It's a whole new interdisciplinary scientific field called biophilic design and biomimicry. It's 2 different things, but basically it's about looking at nature, seeing how nature does it, and trying to put it in either to the way we do technology. But biophilic design is more like taking the design and the qualities of nature and putting it into the built environment. Because not only is this the best playground for every kid, it's also the best space to be in for so many reasons. But we can't get every kid out into the forest. We can't get every kid into nature. But could we get nature into schools? Not only for the physical well-being, but also to reconnect to nature itself and all the benefits there is in that sense. The last 15 minutes I was asked by Nitzan how I do it. So I work in a lot of different ways with a lot of different methods depending on the project, its scale, and the problem of the project. But I do use a lot of methodologies, design methodologies that are one way or the other scientifically based and developed. I've taken a few ones with me. One thing I do when I work with municipalities or big building projects when we are developing a school project is working from what I call the design hierarchy. Often we start by asking questions about architecture, but we should start asking questions somewhere completely else when we start mapping out the concept and the program. We should start with the vision of schooling. The question of what should this school do at all? What kind of skills and competences should we be developing in our students? That's the goal, the criteria of success. Not the criteria of success of the building itself, but what is happening in the building, in the school. So we have to agree on that first. When we've done that, then we will have a discussion of, okay, if these are the skills and the competences we want to develop in the kids, what are the methods then? How do we do it? What does it look like? What does a teaching situation look like? How big are the groups? Does the teachers work together? Are all the subjects interconnected, or are they standardized in themselves? That's the behavior, that's the content and the method of reaching this goal. When we are agreeing on these two levels, and when we've written them down, then we can start building a space around it. Saying, okay, if this is the behavior, what are the actual spaces that can support this behavior? And when we've done the spaces, we can put a building around these spaces. That's working from the inside out and not from the outside in. And it's difficult, but it works. And the quality of the architecture is a lot higher. And the mistakes you make afterwards are less if you have done it and developed the physical buildings from somewhere else than the building itself, but with the question of what are supposed to happen with the people that uses this building. So we end with form and function, with the physical framing and the support of the methods and the content, because that's what architecture and space should be. It shouldn't just be a quality in itself. It should also, and even more, be something that supports the human being and my development to become a better human. That's one method I use in my work. Another method is what is called, it's actually an old theory, it's called the environmental preference theory. It was a city planner in Chicago in the 1980s, I think. I can't remember his name, I think it was Hamlet, who did a lot of research and figured out what is a good city. What is needed for us to thrive in a city, to feel safe, to be able to see where I'm going. And he talked about legibility, the ability to read a space. How fast can I read it? How easy is it for me to understand it? Almost talking about the language of space. Do I speak the language of space? Is it an easy text to read, or is it a really difficult text to read? A physical space or a city can be that too. When you walk into a city, it can be like looking at Ulysses or some quantum physics material. You just don't get it. Another city could be like a children's book. It's really easy to read. He works with these, and I do too, these 5 design principles: districts, paths, edges, nodes, and landmarks. So whenever I develop concepts for schools, I try to follow these to make it as easy as possible for the kids to find their way around, to see where they are, and to feel safe. And it's easier if things has a name, and if they have clear paths, so I know where I'm going. It has clear edges, so I know where I can't go. That it has nodes, so I know where to meet with others. And landmarks, so I can orient myself. See, oh, there, over there is the whatever. I have to go there. This can be about wayfinding and big signs, whatever. There are many ways of doing it. And districts, clear areas where I know this is what is happening here. You can also draw it as it's actually, I see it as a landscape. but could also, it's inside a building, it's a metaphorical landscape, right? But you have nodes like wayfindings, you have districts. I know, I can see, okay, this has a clear identity. It's about identities, physical identities. This is a forest. And it makes it easier for me to communicate with others. Let's meet in the forest instead of let's meeting in room number 226A. It has clear paths. I know where I can go. It has edges and it has landmarks. This is a very strong methodology to actually create big school buildings because school buildings are huge and kids are very small. And putting a 6-year-old kid in a 10,000 square meter school building can be quite scary. So we should do everything we can to make it a safe place where it's easy for them to orient themselves. You can also use color as landmark and border. Here I'm working a lot on biophilic design, meaning I always get inspired by nature. And in nature, you don't have huge contrast colors. You don't have, a forest is not one color of green. It's 1,000 colors, nuances of green. So you can use color as a landmark and creating borders. You can also do it with lighting. You can do it with different changing materials in flooring, whatever. Here it's just an example of how we have worked with color as a border and a landmark. Which created, it's easy to see that this space is different from the other space laying next to, just because we changed material and we changed the color. Here also marks different zones that are different from what's happening here. And we can actually control behavior that way, so we get the intentional behavior of the people working there, living there. Another way of using borders and landmarks are creating these entrances that kind of changes depending on what's happening inside the room. So even before I step into the room, I can see from this entrance what type of subject is taught in here. This is probably the music studio. So it's like a portal, a subject portal, which is also a very strong design grip for making it easy for kids to find their way around and give spaces identity. A lot of school buildings are beautiful, but they lack identity. There are nothing in there that I actually are able to relate to. And then there is the last one here, and that goes for, it's an Egyptian scientist called Magda Mustafa who created this, the Aspects Index, Design Index, actually focusing on autism. But what our data scientists concluded, several studies have shown that learning environments based on inclusivity actually has a positive impact on all kids, not only those with special needs. We didn't know that 10 years ago, but we do now, and that's an important lesson. So instead of designing for the normal kids, and then trying to fit all of the not so normal kids in there, why don't we design for the not so normal kids? Because the normal kids work perfectly in the environment for the not so normal kids. And that way actually making the special more general. And here architects has a huge responsibility, I think, and also a huge power to actually create solutions there in terms of inclusivity and creating a more diverse society where everybody is welcome. She works with these 7 different types of spaces: sensory zoning, transitions, compartmentalization, escape rooms, spatial sequencing, and acoustics. We don't have time to go into it, but look into it. Her name is Magda Mustafa. She's very interesting. What we do is I work with 6 learning scenarios that I actually use as mapping when we trying to program the interior and the layout of the whole school. We do that before we even decide the size of the building. We're not even on architectural. We start by behavior, by how many people, how big are the groups, what are they doing, what are the activities, and then we build from there. And we work with 6 different types of learning scenarios that can scale up and down. But places for lecturing that are built for that, designed for that. Because that demands certain kind of light that are better than others, certain kind of colors, reflections, and then spaces for emission or research. That's another type of lighting, that's softer seating. They all have different design aspects in them that are suited for that exact activity. Spaces for discussion and planning, one for prototyping and constructing, one for exhibitions, and one for movements. And these are almost like building blocks where we can build up schools, and it's also very helpful to translate between teachers and architects, because teachers know a lot about what it means when kids are researching. And also, they also know a lot about what it means when kids work in groups and discussions, but they do not necessarily know a lot about the space itself, what works. They all do it in the classroom. So that's another methodology. And this is just some examples of how it could look. Rooms that are made for discussion and planning, rooms for research, prototyping. Prototyping can be a lot of things. It can be digital, it can be physical, analog. Different exhibitions. This is high-tech high, actually. This one is too. And places for movement, where it's natural to move inside the building itself. I have to skip these. There are only 4 minutes left. So basically, on a bigger scale, I wrote an article about that, the only one in English actually, is 3 founding principles of design when talking about architecture for learning. Where I focus on creating learning architecture where the architecture itself has the ability of teaching kids something. It can be because it is full of solar panels that can be seen and touched. It can be because there are a lot of vegetables. It can be whatever. But the building itself as a teaching material, like a book. Creating school buildings that are like books full of knowledge in itself, where I don't have to tell the kids something about it, but they can actually interact with the building itself. The other one is moving architecture. Creating buildings and learning spaces that doesn't restrict the body, but makes it easy and acceptable for everybody to move around as they feel for it, setting the body free. And the last one, biomimetic architecture, being as inspired as possible of how nature does it, in terms of color, in terms of the way the lighting works in a forest, in terms of materials, surface structures, everything. Trying actually to take the forest, break it down into design principles, and attach it and add it to the way we build schooling. The last thing here for the last 3 minutes is one case. This is a school in Denmark that was just built. 6 years ago, the mayor of this municipality called me and said, Kasper, I want a completely new type of school in Denmark that nobody has seen before, and I want it to be inspired by high-tech high. Can you do that? Can you write a program? Can you design a concept? Because I'm not an architect, so I'm not going to build it. So I designed a concept, a design concept, and the architects were given that, and then they had to build a school. And it was like the basic design program that all the whole competition was based on that. It ended up like this. I would probably have done it differently. But it was based on a lot of the principles that I talked about before and that I have been talking about today. So I have taken from a lot of places. I've taken something from high-tech high, the way they arrange their classes and the teachings and the collaboration. And I've taken some from different environmental theories. But the main design principles was an open school. They wanted an open school, meaning everybody should be able to go in there. That is a problem in itself. Not open in terms of layout, but that everybody could just walk in and use the school even though they were not a student. How do you do that? And still create a safe space? How can you create a building where everybody in the community is welcome to walk in and use the facilities? So they had to solve that. It was also a school that wanted to collaborate with local businesses in the school, meaning they would have to have labs and very professional equipment, so real local businesses actually wanted to come in and work with the kids. They wanted to have it built completely based on project-based learning, where kids always work in projects, always create solutions to problems. They wanted a very, very small indoor-outdoor connection, like it almost would be the easiest thing in the world, anywhere, to just step in and out of the school building and using the outdoor as easy as possible. I also put up some criteria for a biomimetic design. None of the architects had ever heard about it, so I had to help them a little bit. And there should be tons of invitations to move. The way we solved this problem, all the way I wrote in the program, was I found an old theory from a sociologist called Erving Goffman, who talks about being, it's a sociological term of being front stage and backstage. It's how we act with each other. Right now, I'm front stage, meaning I'm one type of person. You're actually kind of backstage because you're not expressing yourself. But you can use that too in an architectural setting. So we created a school with a front stage area and a backstage area. This is where everybody can be. This is the open part of the school. And in school time, the kids use this a lot. But when they go home, this is still open. It has all the facilities, all the workshops, everything that other from the community can use. And then there's the backstage area. And the backstage area can be closed off. And they did it like that they kept the ground level as front stage, and backstage was the two upper levels. And then they had entrances on all different levels. And it works really well. This is more or less how it looks. You can see some of the aspects of it. Trying to imitate a forest means that you would have to create a kind of labyrinth maze kind of look where you just don't see one big open, but that you have all these nooks and marks, and where every time you move around, the school opens up in a new, from a new perspective. They haven't worked very well with areas. It's very difficult to see where one thing starts and another thing stops. They haven't worked really with color coding. There's not very much wayfinding. It's a huge school, and I get pretty confused when I'm there. But probably something about money or a lack of knowledge, I don't know. But it gives you the impression of that this is actually a place to discover, where you can move around and discover new corners. This is the way they solve the indoor-outdoor thing everywhere. Even how high up you are, you can always walk out. Now it's brand new, but it should be eventually overgrown with grasses. Should be gardens up here where students can make vegetables and stuff like that. And a lot of places, instead of just using stairs, and I think you've seen that on other schools too, the ones you've seen in Denmark, are other ways of getting from A to B. That was a criteria. Find alternatives to getting from A to B that are not stairs. And they succeeded in that very well, a lot of places. They made one mistake though. Kids can walk up here and stand here, and there's, I think, 5 meters down here. So now they have huge problems with kids running up here. And that's the thing, if you don't really focus on on kids' behavior, if you lack of knowledge there, you can make a really great solution. But in practice, it's extremely dangerous. And now the kids can't use this area anymore. Because teachers and parents are very afraid of kids going up here and jumping down, breaking something. So a good idea turns obsolete because the design is not made correctly. And they forgot to think about, oh, how does kids actually behave? And then the biomimetic design, I wouldn't say I really dig that. There is something in the material here, natural wood, shifting of natural lights from all different angles, and then some pretty ugly furniture, but at least with organic shapes. So this is what the school looks like actually. Instead of classrooms, they have home bases where everything can be done. The 6 scenarios you saw, learning scenarios, changes here. They can be in their main classes, they can work in teams, they can do projects, and they can work everyone together. So in one area, they don't have to be all over the school. Here is 100 students, and they can actually stay in this area and go through the whole design process of project-based learning. So this is a way of solving the problem of being a small kid and having to run around a full school in order to get from one class to another. So we made these kind of areas where they kind of are able to stay for most of the day. They can move out if they want to, but they know that this is actually where they belong. The last one here, I was told I could go a little over time. Just 5 building blocks for a successful school building project, as far as I see it from my experience. A building project should not begin before stakeholders and users have developed and defined the pedagogical and didactical foundation. The design process must involve those who are to use the school, teachers and students. 3, the inventory project should be integrated into the building project from the very beginning. It never happens, and it always goes wrong. Because nobody thought about the inventory when they made the outlines. And so everything is not sitting where it should be because nobody had the inventory from the very beginning. Number 4, before the building is ready for use, teachers, school leaders, and others should be taught how to use the new building as it is intended. It's a complex technology, a building. You wouldn't give a really complex digital technology to your grandmother and say, hey, figure it out. But we do that with schools. Okay, here is a school, it's based on project-based learning, go ahead. But I don't know what project-based learning is. When they don't do that, and that's what happens a lot of teachers quit their jobs. They get to the new school, it's based on something else, nobody told them how to actually act in a school like that, so they don't like their job anymore. They can't succeed because nobody taught them. So they go back and find another school that looks like something that they already know. So teach them, teach the school leaders, teach the teachers, and teach the kids too. And the last thing, the functionality of the school building in terms of student learning and well-being should be evaluated after a year, what's called co-occupancy evaluation, and money should be spent on further skill set development in teachers and needed physical improvements. We never do that. We only check for the technical. Okay, we do a 1 year and a 5-year evaluation, everything works, we have to check it, but do we evaluate if the building actually works for students? That it actually helps them in their well-being, that they learn a lot? We don't. We need to do that too. We have to evaluate the quality of the architecture from a student-centered perspective, not only from a building perspective. That's it. I almost made it in time. Are there any questions? Are there anyone so one they actually feel safe enough to speak out in a big room like this? We ask kids to do it all the time, and we hate it. A lot of us hate it ourselves, right? Are there any questions? Yes?
If nothing of this is working like you said, like it should work,
Yeah.
how can we make a change? What category can be a generator for change, in your opinion?
How we can...
Well, we don't have the teams before we plan the school.
No.
We don't have the pedagogy when we're starting to plan the school.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how do we do it?
How can we still make a change?
Well, there are several ways. If we don't have a school at all, usually when we build a new school, we already, or at some point, we know what teachers are going in because we're closing down another school or we need a bigger school. So we could find teachers saying, would you help us develop this school from scratch? They shouldn't do it alone because they don't know very much about architecture and design.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, at the very beginning, putting down a team that consists of representatives from both teacher perspective, architectural perspective, engineers, and of course the building owners. But the faster you can put down a diverse team like that, the better the chances are that you actually create a holistic design that works the way it was intended and are able to actually change. Because the problem here is ownership. I'm the architect, I do the building, and I give it to the teachers afterwards. They have not had a say in it. They have never seen it. So they don't have ownership to it. I have a lot of ownership. Like the building I showed there, the guy the chief architect of that school, he loves walking around talking about it, and they have guests all the time. He knows more about that building than the teachers do, and he feels much more attached to it. The teachers don't like it very much, but he does. And he doesn't even use it, he doesn't work there. So the key point is here, ownership. If you want people to change, they need to feel ownership to the building that are supposed to change them, right? Or help them change.
So you say that if the teachers and the teams come afterwards, after the building exists, there is you need a lot of energy to connect them to the building,
You have to spend a lot of
to
energy.
the ideas.
And usually you don't. You just give them the keys and say, hey, go here, your building. And we better be happy because we spent $200 million on it, right?
Yeah.
And they're not happy. And they quit their jobs. And we don't understand why. Well, because nobody taught them how to be in there. And there are no money to do it either. The money's gone. We used it all in the building. But these teachers need a new type of skill set. They need somebody to educate them. They need whatever it is. But the money is already gone. So we also have to think about how we distribute the building economy, actually, as far as I see it. Because in a lot of the cases that I'm aware of, when was another school, now it's been going for 2 years, whole new school, really beautiful. And the headmaster calls me and says, Kasper, we don't know how to use it now. We've been here for 2 years and we don't have any money. So I can't I can't send my staff to courses or anything, and we don't have money to put things on the walls, whatever. So now they're in a new process of trying to raise a lot of new money to actually make it their school. So there's something about money there too, how we distributed it in the process. And I think we have to, when we make these building processes, there's something in the very front we have to bring in, and there's also something at the very end that we also have to extend. The building of the school does not stop when we open it. It continues. And that we have to figure out how to do, from my perspective.
I think it's the biggest message for us.
Yeah.
Okay, because it's our biggest challenge. How to make this extension.
Yeah. And it is really difficult. But it's also just, it's a cultural thing too. We're not used to doing that when we do building projects.
So this awareness is very important.
It's an awareness, yes, and it's trying to rethink the process itself and the extent of it. It should actually be longer than it is already. Yeah. And it should also involve other types of people than normally is involved in it. Yeah.
טוב, לצערנו אין לנו עוד זמן Okay, we're going to do one last quick question because we have to just clear the room, unfortunately.
אני רק אגיד, נדמה לי שלום נרץ בדרך ללונדון לארגן את הסיור הבא בפסח. והיה לי כיף מאוד 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 איתכם. נראה לי פה יצאנו בונדים רציני, ויאללה, בחיי עשינו משהו בדרך.
Was that it? Is there a question? Can we? Yeah, sure.
First, I want to thank you for a very fascinating lecture. I wonder about the issue learning environment, also fast expansion and innovation. They are excellent managers who know how to bring, they know exactly what to ask from you. And on the other hand, there are managers who doesn't know what to say, doesn't know what to ask from you. And they are very far away from the architecture world. And my question is, how do you target and guide them? How do you get them to cooperate? And also, how do you deal with the gaps?
Well, first of all, you bring them into the process very early, because they're going to be the building owners. When everybody else is gone and the school is running, it's the headmaster who's actually in control of the building. So he needs that ownership from the very beginning. And it's a school like that wants to work project-based. That's headmaster there. He's tried to kill himself like 5 times over the last 2 years because he has to lead a group of teachers working a whole different way in a whole different type of building. So he needed to take a lot of courses, leadership courses, parallel to this. And as the school was being built, they practiced at a test school for 2 years. So they have we call it action learning in an experimental environment, where for 2 years all the teachers and the headmaster was trained of working this way, and they were those 2 years trying to build up prototypical spaces that mirrored or reflected some of the spaces in the final project. So they were already there working on the teacher-school, the headmaster-school-teacher relationship in terms of bringing it forward. So that process, it starts parallel to the building process.
I'm sure there are a lot of disputes during this process.
A lot of disputes and a lot of teachers that actually quit their job after they figure out what it actually means. Especially when you change the paradigm of teaching this radical as project-based learning is. They think, oh, that's a good idea, and then they start, and then, is that what it's about? Then I don't want to continue being a teacher here. And others, totally other type of teachers get attracted to it. So new type of teachers come in, so they didn't lose teachers at the very end, they got new ones. But it's really good because then you rehearse. It's a rehearsal before the big stage, right? And it's not a rehearsal that is done with one lecture like this and one visit to another school. No, it's doing it in practice over and over again. So when you actually get to school, and even then, they have spent a lot of time figuring out how to actually work in the school, but at least they practiced a whole year in an experimental environment that mirrored a little bit of that school.
And if the experiment fails?
Well, experiments never fail, I guess. You just learn from them.
Optimism.
And then you change them again. Yeah. But it's just, you have to practice. And it's better to practice in an environment you know than having to think everything differently in a totally new environment too. So you can try to teach differently in an environment that is more or less safe, and then you at least get the experience of that. So the shock is not that much. So basically, I would say that's the way. Get the headmaster in as soon as possible. Create a parallel track where you actually rehearse the way, the idea of the building, how it should function. And make sure that the headmaster gets the courses he wants. And the money for getting those courses or leadership courses or what it is. Because I see a lot of them quitting their jobs too. Like being a headmaster in a totally new school building, that's tough.
חברים, לצערנו אנחנו צריכים לסיים. אורית, we want to thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We have
Have a good
Orit
trip.
from